Hey, Taboo Science listeners, and happy holidays. I hope you're spending time with family or chosen family, or however makes this massive federal holiday most relaxing for you. Today, I've got something special for you, a conversation I had with Oliver Haimson that was too fascinating to chop up into sound bites. Dr. Haimson is an associate professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. He's actually Hibby Thack's PhD advisor, if you've been following along with the season. Back in July, he was only my second interview for this whole Trans 101 series. And we talked about his book, Trans Technologies, which explores how technology creates new possibilities for transgender people and how trans experiences, in turn, create new possibilities for technology. The conversation was rich enough that I wanted to give it room to breathe rather than scatter it across multiple episodes. I'm saving a few quotes for the trans dating episode later this season, but everything else is here for you now. Perfect if you're looking for something thoughtful while you're cooking, walking, or just taking a break from holiday chaos. Enjoy! Your book is Trans Technologies. Could you kind of just give a general definition of what you mean by trans technology?
Yeah, of course. So I actually have two definitions of trans technologies. One is kind of probably what people would think, which is really just any kind of technology that helps to address some of the needs and challenges that trans individuals or communities are facing. And so that would be something like, let's say, an app that helps you to track different elements of your transition, something like that. And then I also have a more conceptual definition that's drawing from trans studies and queer theory, and that's around technologies that actually help. If you think about technology in a trans way, so think about like crossing boundaries and borders of what technology actually is, and this can open up new possibilities and new worlds and things like that.
Cool, great. So, what is trans technology doing for trans people that mainstream technology is not?
Yeah, a lot of things. A lot of mainstream technologies are really not designed for trans people, and a lot of them can actually be quite exclusive, like excluding trans people in certain ways. And I can give a good example, which is around face filter apps. So if you think about, there's a lot of them out there. A lot of them are built into platforms like Snapchat and Instagram and TikTok and all that. And there's been quite a few different gender swap face filters, which can actually be really important for people in their journey of discovering their gender identity and thinking about whether they might want to change that. But the way that these are designed, they're actually not designed at all for trans people. They're really designed for cisgender audiences to kind of have fun with it and see like what would my twin of a different gender look like, something like that. And so what ends up happening is that the way that people are portrayed in that app, they use a facial recognition software to say, okay, I think you are female, so I'm going to change you to this very stereotypical version of male. So it would be like a very square jaw, a beard, things that are very much on the masculine end of the spectrum. And we've done a lot of research in my lab around thinking about face filters. And it turns out that trans people don't actually want things to be that stereotypical. Like most people are not wanting to change their gender and go all the way to, the most masculine or the most feminine. They really just want to be a version of themselves. And so we were actually working on building a face filter app for trans people that was trans centered. And basically, what it does is instead of deciding how it's going to gender certain features, you just get to decide that for yourself. So, different people have different ways that they would want to think about masculinity or femininity. And this app would let you make those changes rather than just relying on stereotypes.
That sounds like a great use of technology for sure.
Yeah.
Let's talk about healthcare. Can you walk me through what it's like for a trans person to navigate the healthcare system right now?
So in the US, things are really not great. I mean, it's a little bit better than some other countries, but basically, if you do have insurance, there are a lot of things that are covered um, in terms of trans healthcare, but it really depends on what state you live in. And so, as we know, there are a lot of states that are not very trans friendly, and they have a lot of power, especially with systems like Medicaid and Medicare, to just say that gender confirming healthcare is not covered at all. So in some states, people definitely have to pay out of pocket. And it used to be actually even, 10, 15 years ago that almost all gender affirming care was mostly out of pocket. Things have gotten better and then started to get worse again. And so one of the big challenges is that a lot of people don't really know which providers are going to be trans affirming or even educated. And so there's a lot of times when trans people actually have to educate their healthcare providers in terms of what kind of hormone dosage would be good or different things like that. So that can be challenging because people then have to become experts in their own healthcare, which we're not really used to doing that. Um, and so, even in the best case scenarios, things are not usually great. And as I'm sure you've heard recently, there's been a lot of restrictions on trans affirming healthcare for young people. And so there are quite a few states that are either have banned that healthcare or are working on trying to restrict it in some ways.
Yeah. You cover this in your book that a lot of times trans people kind of take healthcare into their own hands with DIY things. I know you quoted Tuck Woodstock as talking about the little trans science experiments that people do on their bodies. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about what happens there?
Yeah. So there's there's limits to what people can do. So actually talked with some people who have been trying to experiment with creating their own hormones, and that's not really possible at the moment. There was someone who was doing some really kind of interesting speculative work around using plants and trying to make hormones out of that, but at this point it's all just very speculative. It doesn't actually work. And so what people mostly do is working within the healthcare system to some extent, but as I mentioned, a lot of the doctors aren't exactly familiar with what is the right dosage for each person. And even the most well-educated doctors and experienced doctors in this, it's so specific to each person that pretty much everyone kind of does have to just experiment and figure out what is the right dose for them. And so that is something that is pretty common, I would say. And then there's a lot of technologies that I think can help with this kind of thing. So, the face filter example I was talking about earlier, and this is kind of sad because we weren't actually able to finish the app because it was funded by the National Science Foundation and they terminated our funding a few months ago. So that's why I'm talking about it as sort of something that was we were working on but never actually finished, unfortunately. But things like that are also ways to explore. If I were to take gender affirming hormones, what might my face look like on that? So then you don't have to actually experiment with the medication right away. You can see what things might look like without actually doing that. So there's lots of different ways, and I think that also people experiment a lot with identity in online spaces with things like avatars and or even in video games. There's so many spaces where you can create an avatar of what you might want to look like that you may not be able to achieve physically, at least in the short term, but at least you can have some experience of embodying a different type of physical form.
But the tension between maybe doing that kind of DIY thing and using those kinds of networks and the traditional medical gatekeeping. It's like there's, on the one hand, you want people to have access. On the other hand, you want people to be safe.
Yeah,
Could you talk a little bit about that tension and kind of what the challenge that a trans person is faced
sure.
with there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because as you mentioned, exactly, it's a huge tension because we want people to have agency over their own bodies and their own healthcare, but then there are so many restrictions. And this has been the case for years and years where, especially with estrogen, it's a lot easier to get because testosterone is a controlled substance. So testosterone is quite difficult to get without, going through the formal mechanisms. But for years and years, trans feminine people have been getting estrogen in ways that are not, through the mainstream medical systems. And that can be great, but it's always a challenge of, are people taking the right dosage? What are the potential risks that they may not be aware of? And so I think that that's really challenging. And I think you see this kind of thing anytime uh, certain things are um, made illegal, or basically people aren't able to do something that's really, really important to them and to their identity. And then people are willing to take risks that they may not even want to take, but they feel like it's better than the alternative, which is just to not have access to that type of healthcare.
Um, how do trans technologies help the constant emotional labor of trans people having to kind of explain their identities all the time, kind of at work or in systems like dating apps that kind of aren't built for them?
Yeah, there's a few trans technologies that are really in this space. So they are not specifically for trans people, they're more for allies and cisgender people who are wanting and needing that information. So the main one that I can think of off the top of my head is called Trans Language Primer. And it was created by a trans person to basically help out with, when I interviewed this person, I'm trying to remember what their pronouns are. I think it was they, them.
This was Grayson Simon, who uses they, them, and veer pronouns. You can find the resource at translanguageprimer.com, and I'll also link to it in the show notes.
But they were speaking about their mother, like people like their mom, and like, testing this website on Facebook. Like the people that are on Facebook are kind of like the target audience. So people who are online but not necessarily super savvy with language, but want to do better. And so this is a way that they can look up any of these new terms that they may be unfamiliar with, or understand people's identities a little bit more without having to ask people directly about that. So I think this can be really important. It's also really hard, I think, to maintain a site like that because language is always evolving. And, even since I wrote the book, I'm sure there are some terms I'm using that are outdated at this point. It's really hard to keep on top of all of the new language and the ways that language is changing.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, a Facebook audience is is the perfect audience for something like that. You talk a lot about how a lot of these technologies are kind of, they're scrappy, they're community funded, and because of that, they could just like disappear overnight. Is there kind of a psychological issue there with, like, if you're a trans person who's depending on something that could just disappear overnight, and so many of the things that you use are like that. Just
Yeah,
generally, could you
yeah.
talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest limitations here because I really believe in these small scale technologies. I think it's so important for people to be able to rely on community built technologies. But yeah, as you mentioned, they are precarious and you can't necessarily rely on them for the long term. And so that is um, it can be really tricky. And often the ones that I think people rely on a lot that I have seen sunsetted or, stop existing, they tend to tell people and give people some notice and say, hey, like, here's how you can download your data, or make sure you uh, give people other contact info or things like that, so that people can do that before the technology just stops working. But I think that it's not entirely different from mainstream technologies, because, like, if you think about something like Twitter that so many people were relying on, and there it's less of an issue of it's gonna disappear, it's more of an issue of we don't know who's gonna own it, and it could be someone who is very hostile to the trans community, and then at that point, people have to just figure out how to leave the site, even though they may have built a huge following there or may have used it for so many important social connections, and now they can't anymore. So I think that in some ways, all technologies are precarious.
Yeah, I feel like it must be because I a cis person also experienced that Twitter exile, but
Yeah.
if for someone who's probably experiencing that for many and many of the things that they use, it must be doubly hard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Let's talk about how technology connects trans people in rural areas. I'm in North Carolina. There are a lot of little tiny towns that are hours away from any cities out here. How does that help trans people in places like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's huge because there's often people who might be the only trans person in their community that they know of, and they may not know anyone in the physical world who they could ask advice or, see a role model or something like that. And initially, years ago, there were magazines and things like that, but that's very risky. It's hard to find out about it, if you don't want people to know that you're trans in your family and then you have something showing up to your mailbox. And so in the days of the early internet, people started having trans online communities that started filling some of these needs. And today, there's tons and tons of trans online communities and tons of ways to connect with people, so that even if you, let's say, you have multiple different identities that you want to find someone who shares those, like you're, a trans person of color or someone who's neurodivergent and trans, there are even online communities that you can find at the intersection of those identities. So I think it's really important. Everyone these days is pretty wary, I think, of social media, and there's a lot of talk about trying to have less screen time and trying to, you know, unplug from social media, but that ignores the fact that a lot of this is really just connecting with people, and that's what's important. It's really how you're using social media, how you're using technology. And if you're using it to build really important connections with people and find people who can help you out with advice, or maybe be role models for what you might want to be like someday, I think that's huge. And so that's, I think we're all pretty ambivalent about social media these days. I don't want to say it's only good, but I do think there are a lot of online communities that are still really important, and a lot of these are smaller spaces. So it's not likely anymore that someone is just going to go on, Facebook or Instagram or something like this and immediately find a community. It's more like eventually they might find a Discord server where there are a small group of people who they can find connections with and have a lot of things in common.
Yeah. Yeah, this absolutely reminds me of the last season because I there were so many different little niche kink communities where people who were 50, 60 years old who were like, I spent, my childhood thinking I was the only person like me. And then I got online and suddenly there's this huge community and I felt connection and I didn't feel shame anymore. Yeah, the internet can be so important for people, especially in
Yeah,
yeah, in
definitely.
communities like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk about, it's like there's something inspiring and depressing about all of this research. Is it's that it's so cool that people are like finding solutions and making their own solutions to some of these challenges, and on the other hand, like why do they have to be the people who do it? How do you sit with that tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are enough people in the trans community that are really excited about doing this kind of work and are really excited about technology that at least for some amount of time, it doesn't feel like a chore or a burden. I think that the more difficult part is maintaining a technology over time, and then it can become quite a burden. So there's one I'm thinking of that it was created basically at a hackathon. I think this was back in 2014 or so. And, a hackathon is usually a day or two, and you create something, and nobody is there thinking about what's going to happen for the next 10 years of maintaining this technology. Everyone's just thinking about, is this a good idea? How can I build this? And so this person I spoke with, he was at the point a couple years ago that he was sunsetting this technology, but it had been around for almost 10 years, and it had been a huge amount of work for him. And he was coordinating volunteers, and it was a really important resource. It was a resource site for people to find providers, which is something that is, very much needed. But he wasn't signing up for all of that. He was just, going to a hackathon, and nobody thinks about the rest of it. Um, and so, yeah, I think it would be really great to have more people working on this. And there are, in the study that I did, I spoke with over 100 creators of trans technology, and about 20% of them were cisgender. So there are a good amount of cis people who are doing the work to help out, which is really important as long as they're taking this community-based approach where they're not just saying, okay, here's what I, as an outsider to the community, think the community needs. It really has to start with knowing people in the community, understanding what the needs are, and then building something from there. So, one thing I have noticed a lot is that sometimes when people think they have good ideas, they're not always good ideas. And so, it's sometimes a matter of finding a match between a person who has good ideas and is connected to the community, and then matching them with someone who has technical skills or has time and resources to maintain something over a long period of time. And that's really the hard part.
Has AI vibe coding helped out with this at all?
um I haven't seen much in terms of vibe coded trans tech. And actually, trans people are extremely skeptical and resistant to AI, um, much more so than the general population. And actually, this is something we just published a study about because we had seen it on small scale, in qualitative studies. And I was really curious, like, is this just something we're seeing among this small group of people, or is this actually true? So we did a large scale survey where we compared trans and non binary people to the general population. And it turns out they are much more negative about AI. And so there are a few examples I know of, not necessarily of vibe coding, but just of like AI trans tech. So I have an Instagram account where I archive a bunch of different trans technologies. So it's kind of like being able to have a more visual version of the things I talk about in the book. And I have a long, long list of trans technologies that I've been keeping, before I wrote the book and afterwards. And I just feature one about once a week. And last week I featured one that was a prototype of a AI chatbot for what was it? It was called like Trans Friend, and it hadn't actually been built. It was just kind of some screenshots of what this might look like. And it was created by a trans person. And I posted it on this account, and, usually I don't get a ton of comments, and I checked back a few hours later, and there were many, many comments of people being like, "I usually like your account, but I can't believe you're posting this," and, like, just people really, really upset, and I think that really hit a nerve because it was called trans friend, and it's implying that AI can somehow replace friendship and community. And that's something that is really unnerving for a lot of people. So, yeah, so I've seen this, empirically in my research. I've also seen it just anecdotally in seeing how the community reacts to some of these technologies.
I could imagine some of the reasons that they'd be. I mean, other than the community aspect, just from my own, I
Yeah.
run in progressive circles, and there does seem to be a lot of anti AI uh, belief out there. But what do you know any of the specific reasons?
Not exactly yet because we really need to do a follow-up study that's a interview study so we can see, actually ask people that why question. But if I had to guess, I mean, some of it is like what I was just mentioning in terms of people feeling really uncomfortable with something that's, completely fake that is, you know, pretending to be a friend. Um, I think there's also we've seen in some of our past qualitative research that people worry a lot about, where's the data coming from and then where's the data going. And I think that specifically because non-binary people actually were much more negative about it than trans people even. And so I think there's something there about people whose identities don't fit into categories. And because non binary as an identity is sort of resisting categorization entirely. And then you have AI systems, which behind the scenes are really just built on categorizing everything and then using that through this complex algorithm to create a result. And so I think that just fundamentally, those two things don't match up with each other. And we saw there was this wasn't a statistically significant result, but we did see also that people who are more than one race, so like biracial or multiracial people, also have more negative AI attitudes. But it wasn't a statistically significant difference. But I think that it might be something similar happening there. So, like when you have this lived experience of having an identity that is constantly misunderstood by computational systems, then I think you are just naturally going to be skeptical of AI.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, One question I'm curious about, and I don't know if you're equipped to answer, so let me know if you're not. But I feel like there's at least I have the perception that I don't know if it's a ton of people in tech are trans or if there are a ton of trans people who are in tech, but they seem to there seems to be a Venn diagram overlap there. Um, is that your perception, and do you know any reasons for it?
Yeah, that's definitely my perception for sure. There was someone I'm trying to remember because I did so many interviews and there were things that came up that didn't end up in the book. And I think someone was talking about this, and I'm trying to remember who it was and what they said. But I think that she was saying something about it relating to isolation and, when people are growing up in an identity that doesn't fit and that they don't necessarily feel very comfortable in the world, sometimes computer programming can be a really nice reprieve for that. So, like, a space that feels safe and that makes sense and that doesn't require a lot of social interaction. Um, but I think that that is just what I heard from maybe like one or two people. So I don't know if there's been any actual research on this. I haven't come across it, but it is an interesting question.
Popping in here to say there has been a tiny bit of research on this. A qualitative study of 3 transgender software professionals, 2 trans women and 1 trans man, published in IEEE Software in 2022. These individuals said they chose careers in software for 2 reasons. One, even though the field is overwhelmingly cis men and does have some discrimination, they find that it's safer to be transgender in software than it is in other industries. And 2, the fact they sometimes need to deal with gender dysphoria, anxiety, and fear of judgment makes the work flexibility in this field really appealing. I mean, software engineers were doing remote work way before the rest of us with computer jobs, after all.
It is interesting because at the same time, trans people are more techy, more tech savvy in general than the general population, but then also more critical of technology. So there's a lot of interesting ambivalence there, I think.
Yeah. If you could wave a magic wand and fix one thing about how technology serves or doesn't serve trans people, what would it be?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really this gap between what trans people need and what's actually being created. And so something I talk about a lot is the need for more safety technologies because safety is a huge need. You know, trans people, I think I saw a statistic that trans people are about 4 times more likely than general population to be physically assaulted in public spaces. And so that's not something that technology can fix. You know, that's not, you can't make an app that's going to change people's violent behaviors. But there are ways, I think, to use technology to help people be a little bit more safe and to, you know, to get home safely and things like that. And there's really only very few technologies that are in that space. So if I had a magic wand, I would probably point it in that direction. Although if it's really a magic wand, you know, like something that comes up in a lot of our studies is people wanting what they've called a body changing laboratory. So basically, it's like you can just go in, there's a screen, you can say, here's what I want to look like, and you know, press a button and it's done. And that's obviously not feasible at all. That's not going to be possible in our lifetimes or maybe ever. But I think this points to this lack of agency that trans people have over healthcare. And if it was truly a magic wand, you know, we could create something like that where it's not actually so expensive and difficult and you know gate kept to for people to actually change into the physical body that they want.
Yeah. For cis people who want to be allies, what is it that they need to understand about trans people's relationship with technology, that you think that they don't probably understand?
I think some of it is what we were talking about earlier with technology actually being really important for people. And so I think these arguments to just unplug or like you'll be so much healthier if you just get rid of technology and, you know, have zero screen time and all of this stuff. I do recognize that a lot of people are using technology much more than they would like to, and that you know probably decreasing screen time is important for a lot of people. But I think that they have to also recognize that, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of it is just social connection, and there's actually nothing wrong with speaking with someone or chatting with someone on a computer rather than speaking with someone in person or on the phone or you know whatever it is that people consider more acceptable. Um, so yeah, I think just less of a stigma around being you know very online.
Great, yeah. And then last question, what is one trans technology that you've learned about for your book that you think everybody needs to know about?
Hmm, that's a good question. It's hard because you know so many of them are not around anymore. And so there's ones I've been really excited about, but I can't just say, oh, you should go download this app because they're not going to be able to do that. I mean, I guess for cis audience, the one I was mentioning earlier, the trans language primer, I think is really helpful. So that's a good way to be able to understand some things about language that people might be curious about without having to just Google or, because nowadays when you Google something, you just get this AI summary. And I've seen some things that are completely false on there when I've been Googling terms related to gender identity. So having an actual resource that's created by a trans person with input from community, I think that's really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, I will definitely check that one out as soon as we get off of this. Well,
Yeah,
great.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode. The next episode, as promised, will be about trans families and how even extended family members can provide really important support to their trans relatives. Happy holidays! And if you'd like to give Taboo Science a little gift, might I suggest joining the Patreon? You'll get ad-free episodes and bonus content. You can do that for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/tabooscience. Either way, I hope you tune in next time. I won't tell anyone.